Good afternoon, everyone. Today, I'm going to discuss about climate change in Chapter 9 in Practical Ethics by Peter Singer. Introduction. In Practical Ethics, Chapter 8, Rich and Poor, Peter Singer briefly discussed the argument that the only obligation we have to strangers is not to harm them. For most of human existence, that view would have been easy to live by as our ancestors lived in groups of no more than few hundred people. Today, we are connected to people all over the world in ways our ancestors could not have imagined. The discovery that human activities are changing the climate of our planet has brought with it knowledge of new ways in which we can harm one another. According to the World Health Organization, the warming of the planet caused an additional 140,000 deaths in 2004. As compared with the number of deaths, there would have been an average global temperature remain as they were during the period 1961 to 1990. The immediate causes of the additional death are climate-sensitive diseases like malaria, dengue, and diarrhea, more common when there is a lack of safe water, malnutrition resulting from crops that fail because of high temperature or low rainfall, and lastly, rising sea levels resulting to islands home to millions and disappearing and thousands of families displaced. And these are only the first signs of much greater change to come. The facts of climate change would demonstrate clearly that we are harming hundreds of millions, perhaps billions, of the world's poor. What we are doing to strangers in other communities right now is therefore far more serious and far more widespread than the war on a village. We have an obligation to stop harming them and to compensate them for the harm we have already caused them, harm that will continue to unfold for the next century at least. Yet, causing imperceptible harm at a distance by the release of waste gases is a completely new form of harm, and so we lack any kind of instinctive inhibition or emotional response against causing it. We have trouble seeing it as harm at all. We need international arrangement to deal with climate change, and we need a global ethic on which to base these arrangements. This chapter will discuss what this global ethic might look like and what the responsibilities of both nations and individuals. 2. Enough and as good. Imagine that we live in a village in which everyone puts their waste down a giant drain. No one quite knows what happens to the waste after it goes down the drain, but because it disappears and doesn't seem to bother anyone, no one worries about it. For as long as anyone can remember, the capacity of the drain to dispose of our waste has seemed limitless. No matter how much we pour down the drain, others can do the same. We believe that we can take what we want and still leave enough and as good left in common for others. Now, imagine that we start producing more waste, and suddenly we find that the drain's capacity is not limitless after all. On the contrary, it is being used to the full. At this point, when we continue to throw our waste down the drain, we are no longer leaving enough and as good for others. Thus, our right to unchecked waste disposal becomes questionable. Think of our atmosphere as that giant drain and our waste as carbon dioxide, methane, and other greenhouse gases. We have just discovered that the atmosphere capacity to absorb our gases without harmful consequences is limited. The evidence shows that we are already using it beyond its capacity. Before the Industrial Revolution, carbon dioxide in our atmosphere amounted to only 270 parts per million. In 2010, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere reached 390 ppm. It is still increasing at 2 ppm each year. There is general agreement that if we cause average temperature to increase 2 degrees Celsius, dangerous, large-scale consequences, much more severe than anything we have seen so far, are probable. Until about 2008, most scientists agreed on 450 ppm as the level of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere that should not be exceeded if we are to prevent a greater increase than 2 degrees Celsius. On current trends, we will reach 450 ppm of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere by 2040. This is the feedback loop. So for example, the Arctic ice, which reflects the sun's rays back upwards, melting due to the global warming, and the ice-free Arctic Ocean in the summer absorbs more warmth from the sun, causing further warming of the globe. Next is methane, which is locked up in permafrost or frozen ground region in Siberia. So areas that used to be frozen are now thawing due to global warming, releasing the methane and contributing to further warming, thawing off further regions and releasing more methane. James Hansen and his colleagues to conclude in an article published in Science in 2008 that if we wish to preserve a planet similar to that on which civilization developed and to which life on Earth is adapted, we need to reduce carbon dioxide to at most 350 ppm. So if we think of the atmosphere as a giant drain, then the drain is already overused. We need to cut back on our usage. And how can we decide who should cut back the most? Third is what is an equitable distribution? Under this are historical responsibility, per capita basis, and objections on holding the industrialized nation responsible for their emission. So, in historical responsibility, Robert Nozick made a useful distinction between historical principle and time-splice principle. So, historical principle, it is to understand whether a given distribution of good is just or unjust. We must ask how the distribution came about, and we must know its history. Are the parties entitled by an originally justifiable acquisition and a chain of legitimate transfer to what they now have? If so, the present distribution is just. If not, rectification or compensation will be needed to produce a just distribution. And next is time slice principle. Just looks at the existing distribution at this moment of time and asks on that basis if it is just. One historical principle often applied in the case of pollution is you broke it, you fix it, also known as the polluter pays. This would assign responsibility for fixing the problem to each country in proportion to the amount that the country has contributed to causing the problem. In discussion at the United Nations of Climate Change in 1997, the Brazilian government proposed that emission reduction targets should be set according to the impact of nation's historic emission on temperature rise. The group took as its period for measuring contribution from 1890 to 2000, noting that the different dates would give slightly different results. It concluded that the nation and their percentage contribution of temperature rise are as follows. So in United States, 20%, European nation or OECD, 14%, Latin America, 14%, East Asia including China, 10%, and South Asia including India, 7%. On the you broke it, you fix it view, therefore it is the United States and the long industrialized European nation, perhaps together with Latin America, that ought to bear the largest share of the burden of solving the problem. Next is the per capita basis. China has offered support for the Brazilian proposal that with the explicit proviso that the historical contributions to climate change would be considered on a per capita basis. The assumption here, which seems reasonable, is that each person is entitled to an equal share of the atmosphere, and we should be looking at the extent to which people in some nations have, in past centuries, used more than their share. The report calculates that over the period from 1850 to 2004, the average American has been responsible for putting 21 times as much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere as the average Chinese and 53 times as much as the average Indian. On average, Britons and Canadians are responsible for 16 times as much carbon being in the atmosphere as Chinese and 40 times as much as Indians. The principle of historical responsibility thus indicates that almost all of the sacrifices required to stop global warming should be made by the older industrialized nation. Next is objections on holding the industrialized nations responsible for their emissions. Under this is the industrialized revolution has benefited the entire world. One sometimes hears the objection that the industrialized revolution has benefited the entire world, not only the industrialized nations, and hence the emissions required for industrialization should not be regarded as only the responsibility of the industrialized nation. It's true that the Industrial Revolution made possible the development of science and technology, and this has benefited and is continuing to benefit billions of people all over the world. But it also enables the industrialized nations to colonize much of the world and, even after the era of colonization, to dominate the global trading system. So even if the industrialization has been, on balance, a benefit rather than a harm for the world as a whole, it is a benefit that has accrued disproportionately to those in the industrialized nations themselves, and the emission can fairly be seen as their responsibility. Next is industrialized nation did not know initially that these emissions would be harmful. Another objection to holding the industrialized nation responsible for all their emissions since the Industrial Revolution is that for most of this period, they did not know that these emissions would be harmful. So in 1896, scientist Svante Arrhenius predicted that burning fossil fuels would lead to a building up of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that would heat the planet. So he thought, however, that this would be a good thing, making the Earth's climate more equitable and stimulating food production. In 1970s, human-induced global warming began being studied and taken seriously. In 1980s, only then did climate change become an issue of international concern. In 1987, James Hansen warned of the dangers of global warming. Other scientists support him at the U.S. congressional hearings in 1987. And in 1988, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was set up. In 1990, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reported that the threat of climate change was real, and a global treaty was needed to deal with it. In 1992, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was agreed to by 181 governments, including all the major industrialized nations, at the Earth Summit held in Rio de Janeiro in 1992. This convention calls for greenhouse gases to be stabilized at a low enough level to prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. And in 1997, the Kyoto Protocol, agreed to by most industrialized nations, was an attempt to get action from the industrialized nations that would fulfill the pledges made at the Rio Earth Summit 5 years earlier. The United States did not ratify it. The nations of the world have not done what they said they would. Instead, their greenhouse gas emission continued to grow. The Rio de Janeiro commitment demonstrates that in 1992 the developed nations were aware of the need for action. Thus, even if we accept the argument that the "you broke it, you fix it" rule applies only from time when the biggest emitters knew that their emissions were risking dangerous anthropogenic climate change, it would still be the case that the United States and the industrialized nations of Europe ought to be doing much more than any other nations to solve the problem. Fourth is equal shares. Equal shares has the great merit of simplicity. It is a time-splice principle. It takes no account of the past and gives everyone an equal share of the atmosphere from now on. Suppose that we aim to stabilize greenhouse gas emissions at a level that will prevent us exceeding 450 ppm carbon dioxide. It is controversial how much carbon we could emit per person while remaining below that level. But one plausible figure is 2 tons of carbon dioxide per person per year. Now compare actual per capita emission for some key nations with this statement of 2 tons of carbon dioxide per person that could be emitted each year. In 2010, the United States, Canada, and Australia all produced about 20 tons of carbon dioxide per person per year, while Germany produced 11 tons, China about 4, India not much more than 1 ton, and Sri Lanka only about 2/3 of a ton. It is of course not possible for industrialized nations like Germany and the United States to make such dramatic reduction in the short term, or at least not without devastating economic consequences, democracy, to lead to a change of government and reversal of the policy. Under this is the carbon trading scheme. So before we conclude that this makes the principle of equal per capita shares an unrealistic idea, are two mitigating factors to consider. One, making greenhouse gas emission quotas tradable would ease the transitions to a low-emission economy. Emissions trading works on the simple economic principle that if you can buy something more cheaply, then you can produce it yourself. You are better off buying it than producing it. So in this case, what you buy will be transferable quota to produce greenhouse gases. International carbon trading means that cuts in carbon emission will be made at the lowest possible cost, thus doing the least possible damage to the global economy. Second, a carbon trading scheme gives countries with few greenhouse gas emissions, generally poor countries, and an incentive to keep their emission low so that they have more emission quota to sell to rich countries that are over their quota. So it would involve the transfer of resources from rich nations to poor ones, not as altruism but as payment for a valuable commodity. So second is objections on the carbon trading scheme. Under this is verifiability. One is whether such a scheme would be verifiable, that is, whether the emission of each nation could be properly checked against the nation's quota, and what would happen if it were not. Without a reliable means of verifying emissions cut, nothing will be achieved. So next is payment. Payments from rich nations to poor nations will only reduce poverty if the governments to which they are paid use them for that purpose. In the case of governments that refuse to do so, which often happens when dictatorial or corruption governments earn royalties from the sale of oil and minerals, it would be better for the payments to be held in trust until a government emerges that can demonstrate that it will use the fund for the benefit of its people as a whole. Next is cap and trade system. Refers to any system that sets an overall cap on emissions, divides them up into emissions permits for nation or corporations or individuals, and then allows this permit to be traded. Hansen points out that such schemes have a perverse effect on altruistic actions. If I decide to cut my greenhouse gas emission by buying a fuel-efficient hybrid car, this does not reduce the emission total for my country. The cap determines the total, and if some people reduce their emission, this will make the price of emission permits fall. Under this is the carbon tax. Hansen prefers a tax on the carbon content of fossil fuel, with the proceeds divided equally between all of a country's legal residents. He calls it a fee and dividend scheme. This would reward those who reduce their carbon footprint, and doing so would reduce the overall emission total. Paul Krugman acknowledged that a cap and trade system does not reduce the opportunities of the climate altruism, but he denies that altruism is going to enable us to cut emissions to the extent we need. He also points out that allowing permits to be traded uses the mechanism of the market to ensure the emissions are reduced at the lowest possible cost. Why reduce emissions at high cost if someone else can reduce them for much less and still profit by selling their permits to you? Thus, in Krugman's view, and in the view of most economists, a carbon fee or tax is less efficient than a cap and trade system. Next is population. Another objection to this approach is that if a country's population grows, then that country gets a larger allocation, while everyone else's allocation diminishes because the total permissible emission level must remain constant. Thus, a country with a rapidly growing population is imposing a burden on other countries, forcing them to reduce their emissions still further. Under this is the slow population growth and projected population. So it would be better to have a system that gives country an incentive to slow population growth because different countries have different proportion of young people about reach reproductive age. However, this provision would produce greater hardship in countries with younger population than those with older population. That problem could be avoided if national allocation were based on an estimate of a country's population at some future date. The Population Division of the United Nations Department of Economics and Social Affairs publishes prediction of the population that each nation will reach in 2050. Using this figure as the basis for the per capita allocation would encourage countries to aim to remain below their projected population. For any country that would achieve this would have a larger per person allocation than that to which its actual population would entitle it. Conversely, a country would have a reduced emission quota per actual resident if its population growth exceeds the UN population forecast. Third is execution time period. It is possible for developed nations to reduce their emissions to the extent needed to avoid catastrophe. A carbon trading scheme was one factor that may make this task a little more possible than it is at first seem. A second factor is that the cuts do not need to be made all at once. The German Advisory Council on Global Change, a scientific body that advises the German government, has suggested the total amount of permissible emission of carbon dioxide should not be calculated for a single year, but rather should be set for the entire period between now and 2050, and designed to make it likely that global temperatures do not rise more than 2 degrees Celsius. For this purpose, the Council suggested a maximum of 750 billion tons of carbon dioxide to be emitted between 2010 and 2050. This total, the Council proposed, should be divided between countries on the basis of equal per capita shares. Although the German proposal gives industrialized countries time to make changes, for those countries with the highest current per capita emission outputs, the time is very short. About 60 countries, mostly industrialized nations, will, at current rates, use up their budget in less than 20 years. Some of the poorest nations emit so little carbon that at current rates it would take them several centuries to use up their budget. This means that under an international cap and trade scheme, it would be able to sell a large amount of its quota to those nations that will have the most difficulty in meeting their targets. Fifth, luxury versus subsistence. John Rawls argued that if devoting more resources to those who are worse off will improve their situation, then that is what justice requires us to do. In the 1992 United Nations Framework Conventions on Climate Change, the importance of favoring those who are worse off was recognized by a provision stating that the countries signing up the convention have a right to and should promote sustainable development. This accepts the importance of development for poor countries, but the right to development is constrained by the need for development to be sustainable. The countries of the world, therefore, have, in the wording of the convention, common but differentiated responsibilities. Under this is the subsistence versus luxury emissions. Henry Shue argued that a just allocation of quotas to emit greenhouse gases would distinguish between subsistence emissions and luxury emissions, so that methane from rice paddles in poor countries would not rank equally with emissions from large vehicles used for recreational driving in the rich nations. At the United Nations General Assembly debate on climate change in 2007, a diplomat representing China used the same language, saying that emissions of subsistence and development emissions of poor countries should be accommodated by any future agreements, whereas the luxury emissions of rich countries should be restricted. Drawing a distinction between subsistence and luxury emissions shows convincingly that Burkina Faso is under no obligation to restrict emissions that are helpful for its development. 6. A form of aggression. We could try to combine them, modifying the basic idea of equal per capita shares by giving some weight to historical contribution and some to countries' need to develop and provide the means for all of its citizens. It is clear that on any of these principles or on any combination of them, the rich nation cannot justify their continued high output of greenhouse gases. It is impossible to think of a plausible ethical principle by which they could justify it. We can therefore conclude that they are doing something wrong. What exactly is the nature of the wrongdoing? At an African Union summit in 2007, President Yoweri Museveni of Uganda told the nation of Europe and North America, "You are causing aggression to us by causing global warming." In emitting high levels of greenhouse gases, the rich nations are not deliberately attacking another country, but their actions may have been more devastating than conventional forms of aggressive war. Because of what the rich nations are doing, lands that now grow crops will become barren. Glaciers that for millennia have fed rivers will dwindle. The sea will take over fertile lands. Tropical diseases will spread, and people will starve or become refugees. For at least the past 20 years, the rich countries have known that their actions risk causing these effects. They have known that their actions very probably will have these effects. The fact that these harms are unwanted but unavoidable side effect of pursuing otherwise innocuous goals, desire, is no justification for causing such harm. The doctrine of double effect, knowing causing harm, can be justifiable if the harm is not intended. The goal is sufficiently important to outweigh the harm caused, and there is no other way of achieving the goal without causing at least a great harm. In the case of global warming, however, the reverse is the case. The harm caused far outweighs the good obtained. What are we doing to the people most at risk from global warming, therefore, is similar in its impact to waging aggressive war on them. Because we know what we are doing and yet do not stop doing it, we cannot shrink responsibility for it. We are culpable for the harm we are doing to them. 7th, what ought individuals to do? The next question to ask is, what obligation does this place on us as individual citizens of the culpable nation? When we look at our individual responsibilities as affluent individuals in a world with 1 billion people living in extreme poverty, the answer was clear. We may well try to change the behavior of our government, urging it to increase its aid to the world's poor and to make that aid as effective as possible. But we also can and should act on our own, even if or especially if the government does not live up to its obligation. As long as we can, by giving to aid agencies, stop something very bad from happening without sacrificing anything of comparable moral significance ourselves, then giving to those agencies is what we ought to do. That does not seem to be the situation. A given donation can have a significant, discernible impact, not on the problem of poverty as a whole, but on the child and the child's family. Can we say the same about climate change? At first glance, it seems that we can. Suppose that, like the average American, I am personally responsible for emitting the equivalent of 20 tons of carbon dioxide every year with the lifestyle, electricity consumption, and diet. Then I became concerned about climate change. So I changed my lifestyle and choices and managed to cut my greenhouse gas emission to 2 tons a year. Will the change in my lifestyle have a significant, discernible impact to anyone? It surely would have an impact that anyone can detect. Even if we assume that the result of my action is that 18 fewer tons of carbon dioxide go into the atmosphere each year, that is too small a quantity to have any discernible effect on anyone. That's not to say that it won't have any effect at all, but rather that we cannot know what effect, if any, it has. Under this is complicity principle. So, Christopher Cutts examined that issues in his book Complicity, Ethics and Laws for Collective Age and suggests what he calls the complicity principle. I am accountable for what others do when I intentionally participate in the wrong they do or the harm they cause. This principle is not consequentialist, but says because it makes an accountable independently of the actual difference I make. Examples of the complicity are CFCs, the gases that damage the ozone layer and enlarge the ozone hole, causing an increase in the rate of skin cancer. Individual emissions from many nations were damaging the atmosphere to the detriment of all. International agreement on stopping the use of the gases was therefore far easier to obtain and was achieved by the 1987 Montreal Protocol, which granted developing countries a longer period than the industrialized nation to phase out their use of CFCs. Individuals must think of themselves as inclusively accountable for what they do together. If collectively we cause harm, then even though we do not deliberately set out to do something together, and the contribution of a single individual may make no difference to the harm done, each one of us is complicit in causing the harm and accountable for it. Derek Parfit points out that we tend to think that we can only be harming others in a serious way if there is someone who has a ground for a serious complaint. Now, our actions can affect millions, perhaps billions. This means that we can inflict harm that is so broadly dispersed that no one individual can plausibly claim to have been seriously affected by it. Even if each of us makes no perceptible difference, we are each responsible for a share of the total harms we collectively cause. If acting together with a billion other affluent people, we each emit 20 tons of carbon dioxide. Each of us makes only an imperceptible difference to the climate and so inflicts only an imperceptible harm on anyone. Yet we are still, collectively, inflicting a very great harm on a very large number of people, and we must bear our share of responsibility for them. Next is the voluntary life cycle changes. So up to this point, we have been assuming that my change of lifestyle and that of many others acting on a similarly voluntary basis will over time result in less carbon dioxide in the atmosphere than there would have been if we had not reduced our emissions. That seems obvious, but as we saw earlier, James Hansen has pointed out that if the government adopts a cap and trade scheme for reducing carbon emission, individual reductions in carbon emissions may have no effect on reducing emissions. Suppose my government commits itself to reduce greenhouse gases by, say, 50% by 2050. In order to achieve this, it calculates how much carbon can be emitted each year and auctions permit, which major emitters need to buy in order to continue to run their power stations for factories. If more people install solar panels and fewer coal-fired powered stations are required, power companies will not need to buy so many permits. Or if they have already bought them, they will have surplus permits to sell to whoever needs them. The price of the permits will fall and with it, the cost of carbon-intensive products. Consumers who care more about saving money than about doing what is right will buy more of these products, and if the emissions trading scheme is well designed and implemented, emission will still equal the target of the government has set. So the savings in emission caused by my change of lifestyle will not have resulted in fewer emission overall. Could there still be benefits in voluntary lifestyle changes that reduce emissions, even under a cap and trade scheme? People who consume less demonstrate that we can live more lightly on the planet. When people change their lifestyle, they, ex- they are expressing their values and encouraging others to reconsider their value as well. That could lead to greater concern for the environment and for all who share the planet with us. Changing in consumption could also reduce the profits of carbon-intensive industries and thus diminish their lobbying power with the government. Cattle and sheep emit high levels of methane, and hence the livestock industry is a major contributor to climate change. In fact, worldwide, livestock contributes more to global warming than all forms of transport combined. Because of this, in 2010, the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization proposed a tax on livestock. If they do succeed, a voluntary boycott of products from cattle and sheep would be the only way to reduce the large quantity of emissions this industry causes. If the government's emission trading scheme does not cut greenhouse gas emissions to a point at which there is no further danger or serious damage to the planet's climate, and at the time of writing, no country has implemented a scheme that will cut greenhouse gases sufficiently to eliminate such risk, then to continue to emit greenhouse gases, even at a level consistent with the government scheme, is still to participate in a wrongful practice that will harm others. A non-consequentialist could therefore hold that our intentional participation in this practice is wrong, even if cutting one's own emission to zero would have no impact on the total amount of greenhouse gases put into the atmosphere. This is a kind of I'm keeping my hands clean anyway, even if it makes no difference approach that is difficult to justify on direct consequentialist ground. But some successful movements for change have their origins in the actions of those who resist evil without really giving themselves any chance of making a difference. A resolutely non-consequentialist stance can have good consequences. Perhaps our sense that it is objectionable to be complicit in a harmful practice even if our own actions make no difference has arisen because it will sometimes have best consequences if people act as if they were non-consequentialists. One thing on which everyone can agree is that in addition to being responsible for the wrong we do, either individually or collectively, through our emission, we have an obligation to try to change the policy of our government in whatever way will best slow the rate of climate change. As we have seen, in failing to cut their greenhouse gas emission, the rich nations are culpably causing harm to others on a vast scale. There is room for diverse opinion on the best method of cutting emission by putting a price on carbon emission, which ideally would mean including the price of the activities that emit carbon, the full cost these activities impose on third parties who are harmed by climate change. We create an incentive for finding new ways to discover cost-effective, low-emission forms of energy that will replace the use of fossil fuels simply because they are cheaper. We can also urge government to fund research and developments in such form of energy. In conclusion, given the gravity of the risk that our planet and its entire population face from climate change over the next century, the level of protest against inaction has, to date, been quite small. There is an urgent need for greater understanding about what is likely to happen if we do not start cutting deeply and rapidly our greenhouse gas emission. In this situation, we should be passive spectators. And that is all for our report today. Thank you.